That is the whole importance of these lines of cleavage, is that especially in surgery, you want to try to go parallel with them as plastic surgeons. If they're dealing with wounds or scars, they will try to say, hey, based on the lines of cleavage, how can I minimize any kind of scarring with the procedure that I'm doing? This was a slide before. Again, the lines of cleavage are because of the collagen fibers underneath it. Realize that this is how you get stretch marks, is that if the skin is stretched beyond its normal ability, then you'll get these broken collagen fibers that actually make stretch marks. Realize that the flexibility and the thickness of the dermis, and therefore part of the skin, as we age, gets thinner, more or less resistant to sagging and wrinkling, less resistance to being stretched. Also, exposure to UV radiation can cause premature aging. Same thing, is it can cause the skin to have less ability to stretch, can cause it to sag and wrinkle more. But the big thing, again, those lines of cleavage and what they mean to surgeons. Alright, so the dermis. Remember that we had the nerve cells up in the epidermis. We've got a lot of nervous tissue that's in the dermis itself. You've got sensory nerve fibers. These are detecting pressure, vibration, temperature. You've also got motor nerve fibers, and we're going to talk about these two branches of the nervous system at the end of the semester. But so you've got nerves that detect input. You also have nerves that basically affect an output. You've got nerves that go to the blood vessels that can either cause them to dilate or to shrink, and we're going to talk about that. And also nerves that go to the glands, like the sweat glands and sebaceous glands, that can force those glands to release their secretions. Alright, blood supply, the blood vessels in the dermis. So again, you've got nutrients that they're supplying. Remember from Chapter 5 that an epithelial tissue doesn't have a blood supply of its own. It relies on diffusion, and it relies on other tissues to get its nutrient supply. Same thing here. Blood vessels only found in the dermis. Is those nutrients basically have to diffuse up into the deepest 3 layers of the epidermis in order for those keratinocytes to get their nutrients. So you've got large vessels, as you can imagine, they're going to be deeper. The reticular layer's deeper. The subcutaneous border, those would be the deep areas. You've got smaller vessels that branch up from there that are going into more superficial layers. These blood vessels play an important role in regulating body temperature and blood pressure. Okay, so one thing that can happen is vasoconstriction. Vaso, vessels, constriction, shrink down. So when vasoconstriction happens, these blood vessel diameters, they narrow. They get smaller. So you can imagine that it's harder for blood to flow through, so less blood flows through vasoconstricted vessels. And so when the vessels in the dermis vasoconstrict, is now blood tends to flow through the deeper structures like muscle, organs, not so much through the skin. That allows us to conserve heat. So when it's cold outside, we can do things like shiver to increase heat, but we can also do things to preserve heat. And one of the things that we do is we vasoconstrict these dermal vessels. That means less blood's flowing through them. That means that there's less heat that's escaping through the skin because of this vasoconstriction. Because less blood is flowing through, that's why people can look pale when it's cold outside, is because less blood is flowing through the dermal vessels, so the skin looks pale. Alright, the opposite of that, vasodilation. So now here's where the blood vessels get bigger. As they get bigger, as they vasodilate, now more blood is moving through the dermal regions. That actually allows us to give off excess heat. So we saw vasoconstriction when it was cold outside. We will see vasodilation when it's hot outside, or when we're exercising or working hard and our body needs to release heat. These dermal vessels will vasodilate. That helps us get rid of heat. That extra blood going through the skin is why some people look red or flushed when they're exercising. Alright, so the dermal papillae, which layer of the skin are they found in? Papillae, capillary layer. Alright, those cleavage lines again, and where were they important? If you were a surgeon, were you going to cut perpendicularly or parallel to those lines of cleavage if you could? And you want to go parallel. Alright, so one of the clinical blurbs that's in your textbook, tattoos, realize that the dye of tattoos gets injected in the dermis. The dermis is not going to be worn off under normal circumstances. That's what makes a tattoo permanent. If that dye was in the epidermis, probably at some point it would get worn off, but that dye is injected down in the dermal layers. That's what makes up a tattoo. Alright, so the third layer, we talked about epidermis, we talked about dermis. Here's the third layer, the deepest layer, the subcutaneous layer, under the cutaneous membrane, so under the epidermis and the dermis. Realize that technically it's not part of the integumentary system, but again, because it's so closely associated with it, we'll talk about it here. We've got areolar and adipose or fatty connective tissue in this layer. So where we see a lot of adipose tissue, that layer can be called subcutaneous fat. So it's fat that's under the skin. The whole purpose of this layer is to pad and protect the body. This is superficial to muscles and organs, and so that is protecting those deeper areas of the body, the subcutaneous layer. Again, pictorially, so we had epidermis up here, we've got we've got epidermis, we've got dermis, here's the subcutaneous layer down here. Alright, so since the subcutaneous layer contains a lot of adipose tissue, and one of the big reasons for adipose tissue is energy, it has fat stored in it, is that subcutaneous layer can act as an energy reservoir. For fasting, not able to eat, we can use that adipose tissue for energy. That fat also acts as insulation, and again protecting our core body, our deeper parts of the body from losing a bunch of heat, especially in cold environments. Realize that a lot of injections are given here. If you've heard of a subcutaneous injection, or an SQ is the abbreviation, it is an injection or a drug that's being given into the subcutaneous layer. The reason is that because the blood vessels that are in those deeper dermal layers and the blood vessels that are in the subcutaneous layer will absorb that drug quickly. You think about if it was injected into the epidermal layer where there's not many blood vessels, it would take a lot longer for it to be absorbed, if it would be absorbed at all. So realize you've got differences, variations in that subcutaneous layer based on gender. Alright, so the two types of tissue that make up that subcutaneous layer, one of them's adipose tissue, the other's alveolar tissue. Alright, so again, just kind of putting it together, the three layers we talked about. Epidermis, 5 layers if it's thick skin, 4 layers if it's thin skin. Dermis, 2 layers, deepest layer, subcutaneous layer. Alright, so realize that we've got structures, we've got things like nails and hair and glands that are derived from the epidermis. We're not going to talk about some of them, but others we will. So again, the big thing, nails, hair, and exocrine glands, we're going to talk about sweat glands, sebaceous glands, they are derived from the epidermal epithelium. That's where they come from. So we know them as epidermal derivatives. One of the things would be nails. Now, I'm not as concerned about nails and hair, so we're actually going to skip these slides. We're going to go to the sweat and sebaceous glands, so you can skip these next several slides. Alright, so we skipped over hair and nails. Let's talk about glands. Realize that these are exocrine glands. We're going to talk about the different types of glands. So basically, exocrine glands put their secretions directly on the skin or directly into a vessel or an organ. Endocrine glands send them to other parts. Here are exocrine glands. Two big ones that we find in the integumentary system, sweat and sebaceous glands. Alright, of the sweat glands, two big types, merocrine. Your textbook also says eccrine, that's a synonym for merocrine. The other type of sweat gland is apocrine. So we've got coiled structures that are found in the deeper layer of the dermis that have ducts, a coiled tube that's bringing the sweat up to the surface of the skin. That opening would be a sweat pore. Realize that the glands contain myoepithelial cells. Myo is short for muscle. So basically we have little muscular cells that can squeeze these sweat glands, and that squeezing deposits the sweat onto the surface of the skin. Again, we'll talk about the nervous system at the end of the semester, but sympathetic stimulation, that's the fight or flight division of the nervous system. So again, when you get scared or when you think that you're in danger, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that stimulation causes your sweat glands to release sweat, and that's where you get a cold sweat from. Alright, the first type of sweat glands, merocrine sweat glands. Again, your textbook says eccrine as well. Here's the more numerous ones. Sweat is almost all water, has a little bit more chemicals. Actually, chemically, sweat and tears are awfully darn close to each other, but you've got electrolytes, metabolites, waste products in sweat as well that's secreted by the merocrine sweat glands. Here's a photomicrograph of merocrine sweat glands. Again, realize here's the epidermis up here. Here are the actual sweat glands, these eccrine sweat glands down here. The duct is carrying it up to the surface of the skin. That's where they deposit their secretion. Here's a higher magnification. So here's the actual cells that are producing the secretion. Here's the lumen. Here's where they're dumping that secretion, and then the sweat duct carries it out to a sweat pore. And again, sweat ducts, coiled tubes. So basically we take a slice, we can see, again, it's kind of going in and out of the screen. Coiled tube that's going up to the surface of the epidermis. Alright, one of the big things with merocrine, with eccrine sweat glands, is thermoregulation. Again, as our body temperature increases, it's hot outside, we're working hard, we're exercising, we're producing heat. We need to get rid of that heat, or else we're going to start denaturing our proteins. So one of the things that we can do is sweat, and then that high heat of vaporization, that as the sweat evaporates, that will carry heat away. The high specific heat of water, those are the reasons why sweat does such a good job of cooling us off. But the merocrine sweat glands will make sweat, deposit on the surface of the skin, the sweat evaporates. That helps cool us off. Realize that it's also a way that we can get rid of excess water, excess electrolytes. If we have any harmful chemicals on our skin, sweat can actually dilute them. Sweat is actually not a good place for bacteria to grow, so it has some antibacterial properties. And basically, merocrine glands produce sweat by exocytosis, and remember that is where the products that the cells make get packaged into a vesicle and they get released. That's exocytosis. The other type of sweat gland, apocrine sweat glands. So again, tubular glands, they're coiled. These sweat glands actually discharge their secretion to a hair follicle, and then they follow that hair shaft up onto the surface of the skin. So merocrine sweat glands deposited sweat directly on the skin. Apocrine go to a hair follicle, so they're only going to be found in places where we have hair. These glands produce their secretions by exocytosis as well, again packaging the secretion in the vesicle, releasing that vesicle. Only find apocrine sweat glands in certain places. The axilla, the armpits, around the nipples, pubic and anal regions. These are the only places where we find these particular sweat glands. Their secretion, instead of being water and electrolytes, is actually more of an oily, viscous, thick secretion that has proteins and lipids in it. When bacteria act on those protein and lipids, that produces an odor, body odor. This is where apocrine glands kind of get their bad name, is yes, this is where body odor comes from. Apocrine glands start producing their secretions in response to hormones. and particularly hormones that we start seeing around puberty. And so again, realize that, here's where we use deodorant, is because we find the apocrine sweat glands in the axilla, in the armpits. They're the ones that produce this viscous secretion that bacteria love to eat. When they eat it, they produce an odor, so that's why we use deodorant to counteract that. Alright, here's a photomicrograph of apocrine sweat glands. Again, these coiled tubes. So those were sweat glands. The other type of gland that we see, the other type of exocrine gland in the integumentary system, is sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands produce an oily secretion called sebum, and that's where they get their name from. So sebum's a lubricant for skin and for hair shafts. Again, bactericidal properties. Again, the skin, one of its big functions is protecting our bodies from the outside environment. That includes bacteria. So we've seen where sweat has antibacterial properties. We've seen where dead keratinocytes are not good for bacteria to grow on. I mean, here's another one, sebum, antibacterial. Just like apocrine sweat glands, sebaceous glands secrete or release their secretions onto a hair follicle. So we're only going to find them in places where we have hair. So that means places that have thin skin, because thick skin does not have hair follicles. These are considered holocrine glands, and remember from last chapter we talked about the difference between holocrine, merocrine, apocrine. Sebaceous glands, stimulated by hormones, particularly androgens. Those are considered to be the male sex hormones like testosterone. And just like those apocrine sweat glands, these are activated during puberty. Alright, photomicrograph sebaceous glands. Again, a hair shaft would be right in here. So you've got the gland that's producing the secretion. It secretes it onto a hair follicle, and it follows that hair shaft up to the surface of the skin. Sebum acts as a lubricant for the skin. A couple of other glands that we see, ceruminous glands. These glands are found in the ear canal. They produce cerumen. That's the technical name for earwax. Realize that these ceruminous glands are actually modified apocrine sweat glands. So these ceruminous glands that produce earwax are just modified apocrine sweat glands, the same glands that we found in the armpits, around the nipples, pubic and anal regions. They're also found in the ear canal. Cerumen helps trap form materials that are in the ear canal. It again helps lubricate the structures that we'll talk about later in the semester. Mammary glands, another modified apocrine sweat gland. This one produces milk, so imagine we're only going to find it in pregnant lactating females, is where these glands are only functional. But mammary glands are also modified apocrine sweat glands. Both ceruminous and mammary glands, modified apocrine sweat glands. Alright, picture it's in your book that's showing the different glands we talked about. Here's a merocrine sweat gland, and we know this because it's not associated with the hair. This one can be found with thick skin or thin skin. But here, the duct is going straight up, sweat pore going to the surface of the epidermis. All the rest of them, apocrine sweat gland, sebaceous gland, are associated with the hair. Alright, what does sebaceous gland secrete, and where is this material secreted? So sebaceous glands secrete sebum, and it will secrete them on a hair follicle. Alright, so we talked about the anatomy of skin. Let's talk a little bit about the physiology, what it does. So we're going to talk about its functions, how it protects, how it prevents water loss. We'll talk a little bit about secretion and absorption of certain substances, and then a little bit about some of the immune cells that are there. Alright, again, we've gone over it, we've seen it when we talked about the anatomy of the keratinocytes, but one of the major functions of the integumentary system is protection, a barrier between the outside world and the inside world. So we're protecting the body, protecting deeper structures from physical injury, trauma, chemicals, toxins, bacteria, temperature extremes, also ultraviolet radiation. Another big thing with the skin is that it helps prevent water loss. Is unprotected muscles, unprotected connective tissue, unprotected organs would let a lot of water evaporate. The skin helps prevent that. And basically, water, for the most part, unable to get past the skin unless it's by sweat glands. You remember that sweat? 99% water. So, we'll talk a little bit more about burns at the very end of this chapter, but dehydration, significant water loss, is a big danger when we get burns. Burns compromise the skin. Since one of the functions of skin is to prevent water loss, we can see where dehydration is a big danger with burns. Now, again, the skin's water resistant, but it's not waterproof. Is some of that interstitial fluid, the fluid between cells, will evaporate into the air. It's a small amount. You can get water vapor that is released from the sweat glands. This loss of water, small amount, is called transpiration. Perspiration would be sweating. Here's transpiration right here. So again, the skin is water resistant. It resists the passage of water, but it's not entirely waterproof. I mean, another example of this, go swimming for an hour or two, you get out, and your fingers and toes have wrinkles. Your skin has absorbed some water. Those cells have gotten a little bit bigger. That causes the wrinkles to appear on your fingers and toes. So again, your skin's not watertight. That would actually be a problem, but it's water resistant. Alright, we're not going to worry about vitamin D3 and how the skin makes it. We're going to talk about that when we talk about bones. I mean, just realize that yes, the integumentary system plays a little bit of part. It's not just protection, it's not just prevention of water loss. We have a little bit of metabolic activities that go along with it, vitamin D being the big one. I mean, again, secretion and absorption. So particularly with those sweat glands, the sweat had a little bit of electrolytes. It can also have waste products in it. Urea is a waste product that the body forms. Sweat actually gets rid of urea. Again, we have excess electrolytes, get rid of that. We can get rid of excess water. As far as secretion, the sebum, that's a lubricant for the skin. Sebaceous glands are secreting that. The skin can also absorb things. Now, realize that the skin can absorb some chemicals, but it blocks others. That's just like a cell membrane. So that we can say the integumentary system, the skin, is selectively permeable as well. Because it will absorb some things, but it won't let some things pass through. We can actually use this to our advantage. Certain drugs, oil-soluble drugs, not water-soluble, because the skin's mostly water-resistant, but oil-soluble drugs can be delivered through the skin. That's called transdermal administration. Biggest example, a nicotine patch. Put it on the skin, nicotine absorbs through the skin, gets released in the bloodstream. Some pain medications like fentanyl, that's another big one for transdermal administration. These drugs get absorbed in the blood vessels of the dermis, so they've got to penetrate all those layers of the epidermis. They've got to penetrate the papillary layer of the dermis to get to these blood vessels, so it's slow, but it's slow absorption over a long period of time, hours to days, versus an injection that might last 30 minutes, 2 hours, 4 hours. Transdermal administration tends to be slower but lasts longer. Alright, another function of the integumentary system. Again, it's that barrier between the outside world and the inside world, so it's going to see a lot of the things from the outside world. Bacteria, foreign cells, invaders. So we've got the immune function. The dendritic cells. Again, found in the stratum spinosum in the epidermis. We also find them in the dermis. So these will attack foreign invaders. They'll also attack cancer cells. Because the keratinocytes are multiplying so quickly, yes, you can find errors in copying the DNA that could turn into cancer cells. These dendritic cells will attack those cells. By and large, they do a great job of taking care of any abnormal cells that are caused by that rapid division. So here's a couple of pages in your textbook that's putting all this together, the functions of the skin. Don't have to worry about this question. Again, we're going to talk about vitamin D and how it's synthesized when we talk about bones. Alright, so one of the clinical applications, we talked about sebaceous glands. There's where acne comes from, is the sebaceous glands get activated by hormones, especially androgens during puberty. The ducts of the sebaceous glands get plugged up, that inflames them, that causes acne. So there's several drugs that can treat it. But here's why acne appears primarily during puberty, is because that's when the sebaceous glands are activated. That's when they start secreting sebum, and again, when they get blocked up, that causes acne. Alright. We talked a little bit about it, but again, a function of the skin, temperature regulation, that vasodilation. When our body temperature is too high, the vasoconstriction, when we're too cold, that's the dermal blood vessels that are doing that. Also, we have the sweat glands that can release sweat that evaporates if our body's too hot and cool us off. Sensory reception, most of these are in the dermis. So again, temperature, touch, vibration, those are the things that the skin can detect. These are functions of the dermis, by the way. I mean, and again, you've got some that we see with both the dermis and the epidermis, like secretion, the immune function, absorption. All the rest of those are functions of the dermis, where most of those other structures are found, the glands, the blood vessels, most of the nervous tissue. Alright, so again, figure in your textbook that's trying to put it all together, all the functions of the dermis. Alright, we're not going to worry too much about how the skin repairs itself. I mean, just realize that if you get repetitive stress, I mean, and if you walk barefoot, if you work at a job where you use your hands a lot, you're moving things, you're working with them, that kind of repetitive mechanical stress is going to stimulate the basal layer, the stratum basale, to perform mitosis a little bit quicker, because I need to turn over those skin cells. I need to replace them because they're getting sloughed off because of this mechanical stress. That mechanical stress says, hey, stem cells in the stratum basale multiply a little bit quicker, so that means that your skin gets thicker. Calluses. That is an example of it right here. Again, people that work with their hands, people that may walk around barefoot, or maybe sports or running or something, where again that continual mechanical stress, they develop calluses, thicker skin. Here's why. Is that repetitive stress tells the stratum basale, multiply more cells. I need more layers of cells because they're going to be sloughed off a lot quicker. Realize that as far as healing, there's two big types of healing that we can see. The first one's regeneration. Regeneration is where whatever cells are lost or damaged are replaced with the same type. So if I've lost skin cells, regeneration says I would replace those with skin cells. That means that I've got the original function once they're replaced with regeneration. The other type is fibrosis. Fibrosis is filling in the missing or damaged cells with scar tissue instead of the original cell. I mean, scar tissue is mostly collagen, which is connective tissue, but realize that collagen can't do the functions of nervous tissue, it can't do the functions of muscle tissue, and so anything that's healed by fibrosis may not have the same function, or it may have diminished function. So, something like, say a heart attack. A part of the heart and the heart cells lose their blood supply, they die. Heart cells do not divide very well. And so the heart is going to replace those dead cells, those damaged cells, by fibrosis, scar tissue. Again, that scar tissue doesn't have the same functions of the heart tissue. If the heart regenerated, then we'd see where that wound, those damaged cells, they would get replaced with heart cells. Everything would be fine, but instead they get replaced by fibrosis, scar tissue. The skin is one case where it tends to regenerate. Skin cells get replaced by skin cells. If there's a big enough wound, then yes, we see where fibrosis occurs. That's where you get a scar from. But those are the two different types of wound healing, and just realize the difference between them is, again, regeneration, I've got the same function because I'm replacing it with the same type of cell. Fibrosis, not going to have the same function because I'm replacing that gap